is it our 8th Bob Dylan album?
I think it's our 32nd.
All right. Well, real quick,
I don't know.
Let's run it down. So we've done the Freewheelin', right? We've done Blonde on Blonde. We've done Times
Go
Are
in order.
Changing.
Go in order. Times Are Changing.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we did
Freewheelin'.
Yep, that's 2. And then you did Bringing It All Back Home.
Bringing It All Back Home. Yep. Highway 61.
Blonde on Blonde. We did
John Wesley Harding.
National Skyline. Blood on the Tracks is 8. This is 9.
This is 9. Okay, so I was right. So 9. Well, run the numbers, Matt, and then I'll tell you where it stands.
All right. So Bob Dylan's Desires comes in at number 101 in the 70s. This might have actually cracked the top 100 since we've started the 70s. So this is very close. Number 7 in 1976. Number 402 of all time. It's Dylan's 6th highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. I thought this was in Rolling Stone's list. Magazine right now. I don't see it, so I'm going to say it's not on Rolling Stone's list, but maybe it was.
It's
I don't know. John?
174 on Rolling Stone's list.
On Rolling Stone? Oh, I didn't go back. Oh, really? That's highly...
You better confirm that since you have it open.
174 is The Harder They Come by Jimmy Cliff and various artists, John.
So maybe it was on the original Rolling Stone.
Oh, it could have been.
Because it says in this thing I'm looking at, Rolling Stone named Desire number 174 on its list of the top 500 greatest albums of all time.
So yeah, probably previous list.
It probably got kicked off. Well, we're probably covering this then because it's 101, and it probably wasn't in the top 100. Anyway, John, you're up. What do you think?
You know, if Bob Dylan's career didn't start until 1965, I think I would not have had the negative viewpoint of Bob Dylan that I've had in my career, because this was an awesome album. Holy cow. Like, if we go by the last 3 albums we covered, Nashville Sky, John Wesley Harding, I'd like to go back and listen to that again because that was so early in our run. I feel like I still had a little bit of Bob Dylan stereotype on me there, where maybe I'd like to think I was open-minded, but maybe I didn't. But I love Nashville Skyline, love Blood on the Tracks, and this was such a good album. Like, the musicianship, it's all of the stuff that's good about Dylan without any of the stuff that I didn't like. It was a long album, but it wasn't overly long, where I felt like he was just adding on to things just to add on to it, like I sometimes felt on Blonde and stuff like that. The folk, the folk Dylan at the beginning, I never connected with that Dylan, but like this Dylan from like, and I know there was a period between, the 69 albums where he's doing country and then Blood on the Tracks, The Return, where people are hit and miss on it. I'm not as familiar enough with that to weigh in on it. So Dylan aficionados, I apologize. I can't speak to that, but I love this album. What a courageous song. I mean, you know the song, but Hurricane, but like what a courageous song to write in 1976. I mean, and what a prescient song too. Yeah. Like, God, it's a song that could have been written in the throes of criminal justice reform now, right? And like, just boy, talk about somebody who, and there was a theme on this album, by the way, I felt like there was a theme lyrically of Bob Dylan connecting with the struggles of Black America, because he references like one of his characters, he mentions that most of his friends were Black, this story is something that just, I definitely felt that there's also, Dylan's thing of writing stories about complex characters or even like outlaw type characters. That song Joey is clearly like, it feels like an outlaw type song, which he loves to do. Romance in Durango also sort of has that, like a protagonist that's sort of like there. I didn't do the research, guys. Sarah's got to be about his wife, right? Like that's
it is.
Okay, yeah, it has to be, because it's one of the few times I can ever remember Bob Dylan like being pretty much unambiguous about like writing about something about himself. Like there's no detachment in the way that Dylan often does. We've joked about how Blood at the Tracks, it's like clearly about his divorce, but he left enough distance that he could do. I mean, that there was not, distance on this one. It was clearly like, and I didn't know what his wife's name was, but I'm like, well, that's clearly a divorce song there, so there's a little bit there. So there's like, elements of Bob Dylan's greatest hits, like verbose, wordy sort of poet songs, outlaw stuff, character sketches, love songs. There's a little bit of Jesus in here as well. There's also, and once again, didn't do research, but I would probably bet quite a few dollars for my wallet. That's got to be Emmylou Harris, right?
You
The
are
singing
correct.
with him. Okay,
Yes.
gotcha. Because her voice is very distinctive to me, and I'm like, oh, there. But there's a song with her, "Oh Sister," that's like it's one of the Dylan God songs, right? But she's there, and I want to say it's there. There's
She's
a
out
song
this throughout this album.
There's a I was about to say she's not just on that one. There's a White Stripes cover or song White Stripes covered
Yes.
on here. One More Cup of Coffee, which I recognize immediately from the self-titled album. There's all kinds of stuff. I really like this album. This is Josh said earlier that the ELO album was his favorite. I like that one. This one was my clear favorite this week. This one was gosh, I don't know if I like it quite as much on Blood on the Tracks. I think I'd put it in right up there with Nashville Skyline, which I had as my second favorite. And I would put it above Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61. To me, the Dylan that speaks to me is the very late 60s Dylan and the mid 70s, when he's less voice of a generation Dylan and he's like showing country how to be mainstream, and then like heading into midlife Dylan. Those are the Dylans that speak to me. I in some ways I feel like Dylan himself would probably say they're almost more authentic Dylans than the Dylan he became known for in that 60s period. I can't say that for sure, but his songs just ring more true and more lived in to me. Really like this one. Strong recommend from me.
Is it my turn?
It is.
Yes, I also really like this album. I was taken aback because I was so negative on Blood on the Tracks, and this was just like a breath of fresh air for me. And I loved you didn't mention how kind of Mexican inspired this album is as well. There's definitely like some sort of like Mexican guitar sound to it in a lot of the songs, like like he's writing songs like he's on the border or something, or desperado, or like an outlaw, like you said, right? The other big strength for me was the addition of Emmylou Harris on often like co-vocals or backing vocals. She really added a depth to it, to me, for me, and just kind of the more variety of songs. There's more going on in the songs. There's more instrumentation, whereas I felt, and I know you guys kind of dispute this, I felt Blow on the Tracks was more stripped down and kind of, it was just him on the guitar, it felt like, and this didn't feel like that to me. I also recognized the White Stripes cover of that. I did not realize that was a Bob Dylan song, so that was a pleasant surprise to me. And adding things like, in Hurricanes, like it's got to be like an all-time top 10 Bob Dylan song for me. I've always liked that song. It's such like an interesting story to listen to, and the chorus and like the guitar and the violin especially on it are just so like inspiring and like fun to listen to for such a serious like story. So there's that interesting contrast there in that song. I also feel like there's a lot of country inspired. He's bringing that back in some of the songs as well, getting back to kind of that outlaw theme, like Romance in Durango. I feel like has some like country / Mexican sound to it. And I just really enjoyed kind of the overall feeling of this song. It feels like he was either branching out more or just not writing from, maybe he got that stuff out of his system with Blood on the Tracks, but it wasn't as personal, and I feel like I enjoyed it more as a result. I feel like he was writing from a detached perspective, or just kind of trying different things and maybe having more fun as a result. So yeah, I really like this.
All right, Matt.
Yeah, so this is one of the few Dylan albums that we've covered that I didn't really know. I would say I would throw along what else? Nashville Skyline was one of them I didn't know terribly well, and I also didn't know Times Are Changing very well. So it's kind of nice as being such a big Dylan fan to listen to a Dylan album that I'm not familiar with, and this was a great surprise. Not a surprise. Dylan's great, but it's a great find for me to finally listen to it as it is. Obviously, I knew Hurricane, and I did know One Cup of Coffee. Actually, I first heard that. There was, when I was doing study abroad in Ireland, there was one of the bands that we would go see, this Irish trad band would always cover it, and I thought it was great. And one of my friends was like, "Oh, that's a Dylan song." It's like, "What's that on?" He's like, "Oh, it's Desire." So even though I knew about the song and the album, I've never listened to it till just a couple days ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is I struggle. I don't know if I can just pick my favorite. Dylan's got just so much great stuff, and I love the progression of what he's doing. And I agree, John. This stands out. It's definitely not Blood on the Tracks just quite yet, but on one listen, it's just I love kind of the return to roots, if you will, on a lot of the stuff. The kind of more of the country Americana sounds. The addition of Emmylou Harris, provides a different layer to
Right.
the vocals for sure, and I think they sound great together. For all you say about Dylan's voice,
Agreed.
I mean, he's, for what the style that he's doing here, you bring in someone like Emmylou Harris to carry along with in several of these songs. It's an awesome addition. Also very prominent here, the violin or the fiddle. It's in every song.
Write that down. Yes. Yeah.
Every song, is it not like so? So he's clearly adding that, and that provides another layer, another texture to the music that has never really been in any of his albums before, in any of his other songs. So I did like that. And you're getting other instruments. You're getting kind of like the mandolin, the accordion, the Romance in Durango. I was kind of like, parts of that, I'm like, is this kind of like an Italian or a Spanish type of like, a romantic song? I'm kind of getting a little that Mexican too. Like there's all these other worldly elements that he's throwing in there too. And I love the production. It's got this lo-fi kind of, really minimalist production, I would say. And, but I think
the music is hefty. The music's hefty compared to a Dylan album, I feel like. But you're right,
Yes.
The production's minimal, but I feel like there's a lot more. It's not just Bob Dylan and his guitar, or one other.
No,
I
true.
feel it's a lot more.
Correct. For a Dylan album, he's throwing more in. Certainly not as bombastic as the rock stuff that he did, but the production is pretty minimalistic, and I like it. I think it's got a grittier sound to it, and kind of falls in line with more of the Old West or old Americana type vibe that he's going for, and a lot of waltzes too. That's kind of ties in with that as well. It's a lot of waltz beats, songs in the beat of a waltz, which I just liked. I liked the overall texture and sound of this. This was I wanted to listen to this more than once, and that I was like, oh, I just gotta. So I certainly will. I knew some of these other songs like Isis and Sarah. He did an album, or he did like a concert tour probably around this time in the mid late 70s called the Rolling Thunder Review, which he toured. I think Joan Baez was in that. They had an album which I bought. It was what part of the bootleg series, and I think Scorsese did a film about it recently.
It's on Netflix. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wasn't as huge of a fan of that record. It's just some of the choices that he was doing, and musically I just wasn't feeling it as much. But I like hearing those songs that I knew from that album on here, because they did stand out a little bit more to me than what I remembered what I heard on that live album. So I freaking love Dylan, and I just love that he's transitioned so much. We're not done covering him. We're still going to cover. I believe that there was a Love and Theft which was released on September 11th, 2001. So we're going to skip a couple decades before we cover Dylan again. But if we'll do that again on a cold listen, hot take. And and his progression just is. It doesn't always hit right, because shortly after this is when he goes into his born again Christian kind of stuff. He does some 80s stuff that's really, any stuff I've heard, it's not good. But he's that artist that just always is trying to do something different. And it's nice. It's been nice kind of going through all of his albums, in the 60s and 70s, and just hearing that progression, seeing how he's changing things up. And I really like pretty much every album. I think the one I've liked the least has been John Wesley Harding is probably the one that falls the most flat for me, and it's fine. It doesn't stand up to the other albums, and I think it's kind of, he's trying to return to this type of sound there, and I don't think it has the heft as this album does, or as Nashville Skyline does, which is another album that I liked a lot. So yeah, this is it's a great album. It's my favorite album that we've covered this week easily as well. But it's man, what an artist, man. This guy's got some freaking talent. He's like otherworldly.
And so Matt, tell me about the Basement tapes again, because that comes out in between this and Blood on the Tracks. Is that like B-sides or like random?
No, the Basement tapes was just basically, my understanding is that they literally, this is him hanging out at Big Pink with the band in Woodstock, and they were literally in the basement and they recorded a bunch of stuff together, and for many years it was a bootleg. It was like one of the most sought after bootlegs and famous bootlegs, one of those things that just got that escaped out of there somehow, stole, and people got a hold of it and made copies of it. And it wasn't until years later that they actually put it together and did like a proper production of it. Maybe in CD form. Probably in the 80s or 90s when CDs came out. So I could be wrong about that, but I know that
it came out earlier than that. I did the bio for that. It came out earlier than that.
Okay,
yeah, but it was like the most coveted like bootleg for years and years. It was recorded while they were doing the album Music from the Big Pink. Remember they were Dylan's studio. Like
the Basement tapes? I thought that was from Big Pink.
It's the sessions leading up. Remember the band was Bob Dylan's band when he was in his electric. Remember that he would get like booed off the stage and stuff, and the band were who he recruited to be it, and that's when they entered his locus. Then he ended up in Woodstock, and while they were doing stuff that would become that album, but they were also doing just boatloads of stuff, most of which became the Basement tapes. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Okay, you're right, John, because it was recorded in the late 60s, yes, and then released in 75. So yeah, so my timing was off on that. Yes, you're right. But yeah, it was just, let's get together and do a bunch of songs, and then it just became what it was. So yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, because it seems to be that's another one that's kind of highly rated in the 70s period.
Yeah,
it looks like.
And actually, I think that's where I got confused, because Before the Flood was the live album that was done around this time in the mid 70s. That actually might have come out between this album and Blood on the Tracks.
It's important to notice though that the Basement tapes tie to a different period of Bob Dylan's career. When he's going electric. That is the period. Even though it came out in 75, the Dylan that resembles is like Blonde on Blonde. Not probably Blonde on Blonde's the best rapper. I think it was between Blonde on Blonde and John Wesley Harding, like that era when he was doing it. So he hadn't quite but it makes sense when you think about it, because the band has a little bit of the John Wesley Harding ethos, but Blonde on Blonde's when he goes electric and stuff. So yeah, it's important to note that Desire, which we're covering tonight, is like from a totally different Dylan than what even if they were released within a year of each other. It's kind of like when we covered Elvis earlier tonight, right? It's released in 76, but it's of another era. That's what it was for. Okay. So, and I want to go back once again. Dylan is only 35 when he releases this album. This seems like later, wiser Dylan, and it's funny because now we know Dylan as an old man, right? And yet when Dylan started his career, he was this definitively young man, and so this is like mid Dylan, but it's really not in like his. Now that he's making music and his. God, he's in his 80s probably, right? Yeah. So I mean, it's like, so it's just very interesting with Dylan's career, because it's like, oh, this is like grizzled in the teeth. Is he, grizzled in the, the grizzled veteran, Dylan, but it's like also somewhat early in his career if you take his career in totality. It's before like the evangelical Christian era Dylan comes in. It's like a decade plus ahead of the Traveling Wilburys. It's 2.5 decades ahead of Love and Theft, which we'll cover. 3 decades probably, ahead of it. But also it's 15 years after. Well, not 50. I guess it would be 13 years after like young 21-year-old Greenwich Village Bob Dylan. But boy, there's vestiges, but he is definitely not that person anymore in this.
So
which
John,
for me that's a great thing, because I don't love that Dylan.
I was just gonna say, because like I think going into this podcast, my recollection was thinking like, oh man, John's not the big Dylan guy, and And
I'm still not of 63 to 65-ish Dylan. That stuff
Yeah.
can just go away, and I could do the rest of my life without ever hearing a song in that. And
that's the stuff that he's probably the most
67
famous for.
Right, and I feel it's also, I don't know, man. To me, that's like, maybe it's the Dylan I want to hear, but to me, that's the least authentic Dylan. It's like when somebody's smart and young and they're doing stuff, but you don't know how much they really know creatively. It's not till later that. Does that make sense? Kind of
Like the pretentious know-it-all, kind of like, you know.
Well, it's like the difference between like the Bruce Springsteen who wrote like The River, right, and the Bruce Springsteen who wrote Greetings from Asbury Park. You know, like he's 10 years older, and The River is in Nebraska, right? These are totally different. And once again, that's the stuff from Springsteen that speaks to me more than
become more mature.
Yeah,
like, and it's whereas the first one's sort of like, I'm gonna be the bard of the people and stuff. It's just, and I feel like there's a naivete to Dylan's stuff that, you know, the people who love romantic notions, right, you know, or maybe came of age with it, are there. But to me, it's just much more inferior in all ways, personally. Now I know that'll trigger some people, but you know what? I'll go to my grave with that belief. I think this stuff he's writing here in the mid 70s is way more compelling than early career Dylan.
Well, I love it all. So,
well, you gotta start your 70s Dylan podcast where you just talk about 70s Dylan.
There you go.
70s Dylan.
And cover the albums you haven't heard.